one of the things that I get to do in my job here is I get to pick the topics and the speakers. And I'm very happy to have David Mallon here tonight, Senior Analyst for Bersin and Associates. I think David's going to talk about something that I think is really interesting, and I hope you do too. I'm assuming that's why you showed up here tonight. Our theme for the program here is, one of the big ones is applied learning, and we're about learning theory and then applying it to real life situations. And David's going to talk to us about some of his research experiences and with companies and some of the best practices. But David is a senior analyst at Bersin and Associates, and he's led consulting service practice also at other places at learn.com, where his team visited hundreds of clients and integration and alignment solutions. Previously, he was at several training development positions with Earthlink and other places. So we're really happy to have David here tonight from North Carolina. So David, step up, please, sir.
If you don't, let me turn this on. I think it is on, isn't it?
There you go.
How's that? No, not yet? Go to try that one instead?
Check, 1, 2.
Maybe I should go back up there?
Yeah, we'll get our tech guy.
No problem.
Check, 1, 2.
You want to switch me over? Well, hello, good evening. Hopefully I won't have to spend too much more time up here because I'd much rather be wandering around down there. Let me start off with a little quick introduction about myself and my organization, and then get a sense of some of who I have here in the room, what your experiences are, what your backgrounds are. Let me start by a quick note of thanks to Dr. Williams, Dr. Cook, to UMBC for inviting me, for inviting my organization to come spend some time with you, chat about corporate learning. We are Bersin and Associates. Let me get a quick show of hands. Who in the room has heard of us, knows what we do, knows who we are? Great. I'm thrilled. So about a third to about a half of the room. That's tremendous, right? For those of you who...
Check, 1, 2.
Great, I can move.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Not a problem.
You get it with your mouth.
Got it?
Mouth close to it.
Okay, this is much, much better. Okay, so for those of you who may not know of us, well, first off, it sounds like there's a lot of folks in the room that do. So make friends if you haven't already, and make sure and talk to them afterwards. Get their sense of our organization. But a quick word about us: we are a research firm. We provide research to corporations, to organizations, including in the government, for example, to any organization that does things like training and development, HR, recruiting, leadership development, and succession planning as well, right? So those are our practice areas. We provide thought leadership to organizations in those areas. We help them by doing research for them, essentially identify best practice in those various different fields. We do a lot of network building for them, connecting practitioners to each other to help solve problems. And we do a little bit of assistance insofar as consulting services, but those are generally targeted towards helping organizations take better advantage of our research, right? What that tends to look like, we have a library of tools and research and so forth that we produce. We have then, like I said, network services and so forth that we do as well on top of that. My role, I'm principal analyst, and I'm the head of our practice in learning and development. So I know it seemed like a lot of the folks in the room were either students, former students, or current students in this program. So it means that you are studying to be, or already are, practitioners in corporate training and development. That's what I do in terms of business research, and I'm thrilled to be able to speak to an audience such as yourselves. You wouldn't be here if you weren't passionate about learning, about corporate training, about helping organizations and individuals in organizations be more successful. And so my hope is that as I go through this evening and I talk to you about some of our current research, our current findings in terms of best practice in corporate training and development, I want this to be pretty interactive. I want this to be pretty engaging. I'm going to be out and about. I want you to ask questions. I want you to challenge me. If something doesn't resonate with you, if you find in your experiences something doesn't make sense, this should be a learning experience for all of us, including me. I'll be selfish in that regard. I want to get something out of it as well. Okay? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know you can't really read this slide. That's okay. It's just up there for effect. Let me start by saying tonight's topic, in a general sense, is about, I'm going to, in about a little more than an hour, try and summarize for you essentially all of the work we're currently doing in corporate training and development, which is to say I'm going to stay at a really pretty high level, right? Everything I talk about tonight, suffice to say that there are literally thousands of pages of research on our website that you could drill down into on any of the topics I talk about. I'm going to cover a little bit about how corporate training and corporate learning and development in general is evolving, why it's evolving, and what that looks like. I'm going to talk a bit about, with that, one of the major evolution points is this notion of the rising importance of informal learning, what that looks like when it's done well. And I'm going to end tonight's discussion with what has been a huge topic for us and for the industry at large, which is this notion of cultures of learning in organizations, and what the corporate learning function's responsibility is in cultivating those cultures, and what can be done about it, right? So these are all major areas of research for us. There's all plenty of existing material if you want to know more, okay? Okay, so let me start with a quick kind of level setting in terms of where the world is at with regards to corporate training. Then let me talk a bit about what's changing and what we would consider the current best of training departments out there, learning and development functions, what we call high-impact learning organizations. And I'll define that for those of you who may not have heard that term before, define that for you a little bit later. And then, like I said, I'll end tonight with a discussion about our research in terms of cultures of learning. Now, if you've, I know some of you know, it looked like a decent number of you are familiar with us, which means you've probably perhaps seen some of our research before. You may have even seen a presentation by myself or by Josh or by one of my peers. So you're probably familiar with this slide because we use it a lot. It's a great place to get started. Now, for those of you who are either current students or recent graduates, or you're just getting out there, trying your hand at getting a job in today's work environment, you're probably, it's going to come as no great surprise to you that it's a pretty challenging and economic place to work, not just for you individually, but for the companies that you serve, right? The economy places huge stresses on our organizations. Those stresses roll down to us in the learning functions. But guess what? The economy is not the only source of stress for organizations right now, or for you, right? Our demographics, there's a lot of press recently about the dumbbell shape, right? That we have, most of our organizations, a large percentage of your senior, your most experienced, your highest performing, most, just where all of the expertise in your organization lies is nearing retirement. And then there's a dip. And then you're replacing them with large numbers of new hires that are coming to the door with very, very, very different expectations for their organizations. What they expect in terms of how they're treated, they're compensated, they're developed, everything that is their work life, right? Their expectations are very different. So these demographic changes place a lot of pressures on our organizations, and those pressures roll down to us in the learning function. Technology. We can do some pretty amazing things today. Things that we couldn't do even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, especially in the learning organization as well. Tremendous advances in what's possible. But with technology comes good sides and bad sides, right? We're also overwhelmed with the amount of information that's available to us. And how do we sift through all that information? How do we sift through all that knowledge to know what's truly relevant, what's truly in context for my job, for the business problem I need to solve right now, to be successful for myself and for my organization, right? And so all of these pressures place tremendous challenges on organizations. They challenge us as well. I want to dig into a little bit more into this workforce idea. I'm going to, as an analyst firm, just so you know, expectation setting, I'm going to throw numbers at you a lot this evening. Okay? I'll try not to, too much, but I'll try to make sure I always have a story around it. So at least there's, I like this notion of applied research, right? Which is as Greg was describing, is very fundamental to this program. That's a lot of what we do as well. Our buzzword for our company is what works. Right? So we're trying to focus on research. We're trying to focus on what works out of that research to help organizations be successful. So the workplace, the workforce, they're changing. More interconnected, more global, even for organizations that aren't necessarily global. You could be a small business these days and yet still have to think of yourselves as a global organization. How companies hire today is actually, that's one of our practice areas, is recruiting. And it's much different than it was even a couple of years ago. You would think, the way the employment numbers are today, you'd think it would be a buyer's market for companies when it comes to hiring. In reality, it's extraordinarily, most companies tell us it's actually more difficult to find good help today, especially in key skill positions. Because they can't tell, they're having a really hard time telling the really good candidates from the rest, right? So the just social and collaborative nature of our world today place new ideas as to what leadership means in organizations, right? So just notions of the kinds of leaders we're going to need to be successful in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 20 years are changing how organizations develop their future leaders, right? And the models they use in terms of growing people up through the organization, right? So all of these evolutionary pressures, I should say, they are changing fundamentally what you and I do in this room, how we're asked to do the fundamentals of corporate instruction, learning and development, what have you, right? How we plug in to our organizations, the very relationship that we have with our employees is changing. Now, let me walk through what that looks like. We do a study every 6 months. It's a checkpoint study. We interview HR leaders, we interview business leaders, and we ask them some recurring questions, sort of constant touch point on pulse of where organizations are today. And we call this our Talent Watch report. And I realize this, I'm realizing that this slide's probably difficult to read, especially for those of you in the back of the room and the lighting. So I'll do my best to sort of give you a sense of what's up here. We asked organizations, what are your top business challenges? And so some of the things, some of the choices up here, cutting costs, surviving the downturn, accelerating innovation, declining margins. These are all things that different organizations might care more or less about, depending on the kind of organization, what have you, right? Well, when we asked this question last summer, right, you would not be surprised to learn that the biggest pressures, the most important problems to businesses at the time were cutting costs, surviving the downturn, right? When we asked this question again earlier this year, big change. Now the fastest growing problem, innovation. The second fastest growing, actually the other way around, fastest growing problem is global expansion. Second biggest, fastest growing problem is innovation. Now, okay, there's actually some reason to be a little optimistic in that those are the two big things right now, right? So organizations are concerned about expansion. They're concerned about, are they innovating fast enough? Okay, great. That means that at least business leaders are thinking that there's kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. They're sort of planning for what's coming next. But that also means that they're suddenly going to turn on and come to you, the learning function, asking for very different things than they were a year ago. It's not necessarily about cutting costs now. It's about, are we going to have the right people in the right place? Are we going to be able to create that widget that we haven't even thought of yet? Right? Do we have the skill sets? So if I would show you, let me break this down. I'll show you, if we go, I'm sorry, I skipped right past it. If we break this down even further, we see 44% of organizations focused on new products and services. Okay? Now, continue that forward to what then your role in those new products and services are, right? Do we have the right people in the right place to make sure those products and services happen? 52% see growth. Are we going to be able to have the right prepared people to support that growth? Are we going to have the right prepared people to sustain that growth? Right? Now, I also said that how we do what we do is changing. Well, we asked a question of our business leaders as well. What of the various different ways that, that learning can happen in organizations, business leader, of all the various different ways that your folks can learn, which do you think are most impactful? Which do you think actually provide the most benefit to you? Well, by far, and just so you know, in terms of numbers, we gave them the opportunity to pick more than one. That's why the numbers don't necessarily add up to 100. By far, our business leaders are telling us that on-the-job experience is what they believe is the most effective way. Now, you know what? Even for those of us who are learning professionals, okay, that's not that controversial. We get that even for us, we learn on the job pretty well, right? So you see then the second thing on this list is those ways that we try to leverage on-the-job experience for structured learning purposes. So things like job rotations, stretch projects, and the like. Coaching, third on the list. Okay, that makes sense. Having someone sit down in a concerted way, show me how to do something, and give me feedback, also very effective, and I don't think any of us would argue with that. But it's interesting that it isn't until the fourth thing on this list, and only not even a third of business leaders even checked it as an option, do we get to formal instruction. This is the environment that we work in, is that our businesses believe that the best way to learn is not necessarily what we do. Right? So our challenge is to figure out, okay, so what's our place in all of this? How do we take full advantage and leverage where we all know the kind of power energy really is, right? Now, at the same time, we're doing this with smaller budgets. We do a yearly demographic study of the market. We look at overall training budgets. We look at who's spending money, what are they spending it on, what programs are getting preferenced, what technologies are getting purchased, what have you. You can see in 06, in 07, training budgets growing reasonably, a steady number. In 08, 09, falling fairly precipitously. And from what we can tell, we've already collected the data for next year. It won't be quite the dip that you saw in the last couple of years, but it's not the positive number you see prior either. I think it's fair to say in terms of training budgets, what we're seeing is we're in a new reality that is our reality. Okay? So, okay. So what we're being asked to train on, innovation, growth, thinking ahead, thinking about things that, being prepared for things we're not prepared to do yet. Okay. But yet, we have to do it differently because our businesses are saying we don't necessarily think how you currently do it's the best way. And oh yeah, by the way, do it with less money. Right? That's the world that we live in currently as learning professionals. Now, when we have these pressures that come from economic cycles, these do show up, these do have real effects on the evolution of our discipline. When you look at the last recession, it actually coincides quite nicely with when organizations really started to rush to take learning online. Was it necessarily a cause of the interest in e-learning? No. But it made companies pay attention to it in a way that kind of grabbed hold of some organizations' attention in a way that may, at a speed that they wouldn't necessarily have gone to. Similarly, in this particular downturn, is it driving organizations' interest in social learning, informal learning, new methods and methodologies, the virtual classroom, mobile, what have you? No. And would those things already be growing and be of interest to organizations? Most likely, yes. But it is fair to say that just like I showed you a couple slides ago, with budgets falling as they are, it raises the stakes. Right? It makes organizations pay more attention to these sorts of things because of this conversation that I'm starting with us tonight. It forces both our businesses as well as us as learning professionals to ask the question, are we doing this as well as we could be doing this? Are we as efficient as we think we could be? Are we as effective as we think as we could be? We know what we did yesterday isn't going to work tomorrow. So let's at least figure out what tomorrow looks like. Right? It at least forces us to have that conversation. Now, we've been watching enterprise learning for a while, watching it evolve. And this is just a summary slide. 10 years ago, the conversation in most corporate learning functions was this notion of, oh, great, e-learning. What should we do with that? Let's start moving content online. Let's start creating e-learning courses, what have you, right? And then the conversation switched subtly to, wait a minute, maybe not everything needs to be online. Let's do blended learning. Let's figure out how to do the best of. Let's use the classroom for what the classroom's best at. Let's use the self-paced course for what it's best at. Let's use performance support and other kinds of methodologies to kind of as the ties that bind, right? Recently, in the last few years, the conversation in especially larger organizations is transitioning to this notion of integrated talent management. So it's not just how learning and what we do and how we do it. It's how do we plug into the other people processes in the organization. How does learning interact with the recruiting department, the performance management and review processes the organization has, succession planning, leadership development, workforce planning. So organizations can do big picture strategic talent plans, and they can know that, okay, we're going to start rolling out a new widget in the second half of next year, and that's going to require 50 new engineers of this particular type. But we know we can't hire 50 new people, so let's look at what people do we have in stepping stone positions along the way, and what do we need to do between now and the second half of next year to make sure those 50 people are prepared for that job when we need them to be prepared for it, right? And the companies are beginning to be able to have those big picture talent conversations. So how does learning fit in all of that? Well, in the last year or so, we're still talking integrated talent management, but now we're talking about informal learning as well. Now, all along, the notion of alignment and actually working on what our business wants us to work on has never changed in its overall importance. And as I start to go forward now and talk about what it means to be a high-impact learning organization, you'll find that it really is, you can be effective, you can be efficient, but neither of those two things mean anything if you aren't actually aligned with your business. Right? So without further ado, let's dive into high-low, as we call it, high-impact learning organizations. So I presaged this concept a bit just now. This is a core part of our research in enterprise learning. It's actually Josh Bersin, our founder and president. In the work we've done on our learning practice, is fair to say, is our most mature. It's been the area we've been focused on since the beginning of our organization. If there were two general streams to our learning research all along, they've been, on one side, learning technology focused. So a lot of organizations know us for our LMS research, for instance. We're about to publish the latest version of that next month. It's kind of like the Consumer Reports Buyer's Guide for learning management systems, right? Now, aside from that, when it comes to the practice of learning, this notion of what makes a high-impact learning organization is the other big anchor point to what we do in corporate learning. It is about what is it, looking at the question of what is it that makes it such that some training departments, some L&D organizations, are able to impact their business positively more so than others, and why, right? Now, I should actually walk you through this first. High-impact learning organizations affect their businesses, we find, in three key ways. Now, the first is the one that most training departments, most L&D departments, pretty okay with, pretty familiar with. It's what you all thought you were doing all along, just skill and competency development. Prepping people to do certain roles, helping them to add new skills, to grow new competencies, to do whatever it is that their job requires. Okay? Related to that is bigger picture, more strategic, is this notion of talent capability development. So that is looking at what the organization needs from overall skill gap questions and making sure the organization's talent needs are met. Increasingly, though, we find high-impact learning organizations understanding that they have a responsibility for this notion of cultures of learning, the value of learning in the organization, the degree to which the organization itself as a whole, as a unit, learns. How agile is your organization? How well and capable are you of responding to changes in the environment? Adding new knowledge or skills as needed, not just necessarily to prep for a particular job role or to add a certain skill. Right? And we'll come back to learning culture, like I said, in the last third of tonight, but I want to start just planting that seed in the back of your mind. As I go through some of the other things tonight, think about how this, even just in your own organizations you already work in, maybe even here at the school, how does the kind of underlying value given to learning, given to development, how does that affect the success of what you do? Vice versa, how are the programs, the projects, the things that you're doing, the interventions you're creating for your organizations, how are those actually fostering or helping to grow a culture or value for learning and development in the organization? High-impact organizations, they drive success in their businesses through helping to grow specialization. And what we mean by that is not just, we're finding a change in the understanding of what leadership development means in organizations. This is one example. Organizations are realizing that the traditional notions of a kind of growing people up a pyramid of, and I'll show you that pyramid here in a second. The traditional notions of growing people up a pyramid from general leaders to start to create the kind of all-purpose leader, right, isn't necessarily as effective or as useful as it once was. They're finding that they have to pay attention to, they have to create strategies for, they have to develop people who are experts at what makes that company special. They have to create people who are foundational to what gives them competitive advantage in the marketplace. Right? And it's just as important to create leadership development programs that create those specialist leaders as it is to create the people who will one day be, let's say the CEO. Because in reality, you need a lot more of those specialist leaders than you need a CEO. Right? You only need one of them, theoretically. Right? At the same time, high-impact learning organizations address this notion of learning agility, which is partly the concept of learning culture I was talking about. Now, how they do this is our enterprise learning framework, and it's one of the handouts I believe you have. All learning functions, what this is not meant to be an org chart. It's not a process chart. It's not a, every training department's going to have these functions kind of thing. It's more I like to describe it as, so let's say you had never had anything to do with learning, training. You didn't know what this field was in the slightest, and your business came to you one day and said, guess what, you're CLO now. Like, oh, really? What does training do, right? That's what we kind of like to use this framework to kind of answer that question. All learning organizations, no matter where in the organization you sit, you have programs you create. Those programs match up to certain audiences with certain business problems. So let's say salespeople with sales programs, right? You have approaches you use to make those programs happen. In the past, those approaches might have been fairly traditional. Some classroom instruction, maybe e-learning course or two, labs, performance support, what have you. Increasingly, organizations are recognizing their toolbox is a bit bigger than that. They can use more informal, more embedded forms of learning. You have certain disciplines you've mastered to make those approaches happen. Instructional design is one example. Project management. But increasingly, organizations are finding they have to add new disciplines to their learning teams. Community management. How many of you are learning essentially the discipline that is community management today? Looks like everybody's got one hand. The thing is that we're finding more and more learning functions recognizing they have to have that skill because it's becoming just as important to their success. You have tools and technologies you use to do this. Sometimes those tools are truly technical, a la a learning management system or a content development tool. Sometimes they're just more tools in the conceptual sense, but you have the things you use to make this possible. And then you have this notion of culture and how culture affects the success of your programs, and then how you are responsible or how what you're doing grows the culture of learning in the organization. So this is what this is meant to do. And as I go forward, I'm going to keep referencing this. I want to point out one other thing, which is that right-hand column, the learning architecture. I'll go into this a little bit more in a second. I'll show you an example from one organization. But this is how organizations put all these boxes together in some unified whole. And they write down and they decide for themselves, OK, for a certain set of programs, we'll generally use, depending on the problem, a certain set of approaches which are going to require a certain set of disciplines, tools, technologies, and here's how culture fits. And they define this. And here's the really important part. They go and they get their stakeholders' buy-in for how they've decided this, what learning looks like in their world. And this is tremendously effective at essentially scope, at defining scope and what is kind of in scope for learning and what isn't. And also for, especially in organizations that are beginning to do more with informal, at actually really defining for the rest of the organization what that really looks like, again, in the big picture, sort of how all these other moving parts plug in together. Okay. Now, I mentioned this notion of specialization. I told you I would show you this pyramid. This is, I think, another slide you have in your deck. What I really want to draw your attention to here is some of the organizations that we've profiled here at the bottom. GE, Qualcomm, Accenture, Credit Suisse. Obviously, these are all big companies, and they have deep pockets. They can focus a lot of money on learning and development. And certainly, it makes sense that those organizations would understand the value. Boeing is a good example. Boeing has tremendous programs for their engineers and growing new engineers, right? And Boeing can't wait for what the universities are going to deliver to them in terms of new hires. Boeing can't just rely on what graduates are going to come in with in terms of skills and so forth. Boeing has to be proactive and create their own schools to grow the particular kinds of skill sets they need at speeds that they need them at, that kind of thing, right? But all these organizations, what they have in common is a recognition that specialization is what makes them special in the market. And so therefore, how they think about learning and development at a big picture level has to address, again, leadership development. This is truly, they think of this as leadership development just as much as they would growing the next generation of C-level leaders for their organizations. They have to put the same amount of resources and money behind it because it's these specialist experts who will ultimately determine if they're successful. Now, I will make another point which say it's not just these big companies that are coming to this conclusion. A lot of smaller organizations, a lot of kind of mid-market organizations are also recognizing this. The thing is at that level, you may or may not have the ability to, you might not have the resources to have truly specialists in certain positions, but the concepts are still there. What does this look like for us in terms of what's different about this for us as learning organizations? Well, one is in this notion of career development. Companies are recognizing that they really have to invest in strategic career development. It can't just be, how many of you would say this fits the organizations you currently work for, in which you'd say career development is something that they would say, oh, that's the employee's responsibility. That's their job to figure out what their career is. A few? OK. Well, if I was, so you would fall on the far left over here, the dots underneath individually. The individual is responsible for it, right? And so a lot of organizations are there. In fact, we would say probably a preponderance of organizations are at that point. Those that say that they organize it, think about it, are strategically approaching it at an enterprise level, that it's not just the employee's responsibility, that it's everybody's responsibility, it's the company's responsibility to think about it in a strategic sense. That's the the other end of the spectrum, right? What you're seeing in terms of the chart here is their overall business performance. There's a tremendous return on investment to organizations that think strategically about something like career development. Now, similarly, development planning. How many of you would say that, well, first off, how many of you, the organizations you work for, have an individual development planning process? Okay, maybe about a third. And is it directly attached to your performance management appraisal process in some way? Some. I'm kind of getting mixed reviews on that one, right? In some organizations it is, and some it isn't. Well, actually, let me ask this question, because of those of you who were kind of nodding your heads, how many of you would say that your IDP process is your performance process? Like it is the reason you're doing performance? A few. OK. That's where we think most companies should go, and very few are, right? But that said, organizations that are very effective at individual development planning processes that have, or would say they have very effective IDP processes, twice the median revenue per employee. 23% better at developing the future leaders of their organization. So again, this is what I mean in terms of what's changing about how we do what we do is there's a real value to thinking about it as an integrated whole, to being more strategic about it. The other thing that is changing about how we do what we do, and this actually affects those of, I will say, I don't have an instructional design background, but in terms of my life as a learning practitioner, I was running departments of instructional designers. I was responsible for content development for a while, so I still feel a little kinship, even though I know I'm not an ID. This is one of those areas that is of most concern, interest, in a good way, I think, to the field that is instructional design. And that's the change in the relationship between learning professionals and the business. And the fairest way to sum this up is that learning has to and is evolving to be an enabler, not a source. So rather than organizations asking you to create and to be the kind of blessed source of corporate learning or corporate knowledge, your organizations are asking you to change to be, for those of you who might have any sort of a financial background, or maybe you have a financial account yourself, you might know what a market maker does. Market makers are what make the stock market work. They're the people who find buyers and sellers and connect them, right? That's what our role as learning is becoming, is market maker for corporate knowledge. So guess what? Sometimes you're going to be the source of what a particular employee needs to be successful. But oftentimes you're not. Oftentimes some other person in the organization will be. Some other source will be, external, internal, what have you, right? And your role becomes, as learning professional, to connect people to people and people to learning and people to knowledge, more so than to be the source of it, right? Now, we'll talk a little bit in a second about what that means in terms of the disciplines that we have, including instructional design. So what separates then, I've begun to paint a picture for you then of what this new high-impact learning organization is. What separates these organizations from the rest? So again, what's different about their disciplines? What's different about their tools? What's different about their learning cultures? What's different about the approaches they use? Well, this is one of the handouts I gave you, and this is one where if you want to know more about this one, just come talk to me afterwards, because I could do the whole presentation on this index, and we'd spend the whole evening talking about it. Suffice to say, we did a big study last summer on this notion of what's changing about learning, and particularly about informal learning, and organizations that are doing it very well. And we looked at what's separating those that were good at it from the rest. And we came away with an index of 10 kind of high-level flagpole benchmarks, you might say, kind of ways to understand for a particular learning organization, will they be successful at where we see all of this going in the future? Okay? Those 10 things are, one, that your learning organization can add skills to your own team faster than your business needs them. Right? How quickly can you grow? Right? How well or apt are you at analyzing your business? Can you dig your hands in, get your hands dirty, and understand what your business does? Can you become an expert at what your business does? Okay? Are you efficient with content? Seems like a no-brainer, but it's a really hard thing. Can you adapt all of what you do to all the various different audiences that you serve? So increasingly, that means generationally. That might mean globally in terms of cultures. That might mean different environments, so you might have to create learning for a factory floor, but you also have to create it for an office. Can you adapt it to those two environments, right? So there's lots of things that rolls up underneath that. Versatility. Can you create what you do in all of the modalities that your business audiences use? So for instance, the big one here is a surprising number of organizations would say that more of their employees these days have a mobile device than sit at a PC. So why isn't the mobile device your primary way of getting information to them? So that's certainly there's a lot of challenges. That's easier said than done, but you kind of get the idea. Do you think about what you do in business terms? Are you driven by the business terms? Do you measure what you do in business terms? Do you talk in business terms? Is everything what you do linked to the larger talent needs of your organization so you understand there's just a strategic role that you play? Are you measuring yourself in terms of timeliness, meaning you can, whatever it is you do it at the speed your business requires? Is it targeted, meaning you never throw things up on the wall? The days of kind of these big libraries of corporate training and just letting the end user employee kind of pick, that's going away. I mean, it's expensive, it's hard to keep going, it's hard to keep up, and it doesn't necessarily provide value. And finally, proximity. Do you ask yourself the question in everything that you do, are you delivering learning as close to where work happens as possible? And you reserve the sabbatical event, the classroom, for only those times in which it's really absolutely necessary. So if you hold yourself to these sort of 10 principles, these really seem to define this notion of the modern high-impact learning organization. Now, we checked out a bunch of companies on this index globally, and this is the overall breakdown of organizations worldwide in our study. So you see most organizations are not very good at that index. Most are just kind of mediocre, which is the bell curve. You'd expect that. A few are very good, a few not so good. Suffice to say, when we look at this deeper and we look by industries and what have you, similar things. No one industry actually has it up on any other here. In fact, I'm going to share with you some stories in a little while that will show you that, again, any preconceived notions you might have about different kinds of companies, different kinds of employees, different kinds of skill sets don't necessarily apply here. What is this about, though? This is a pretty simple concept and idea to those of us in instructional design. This is about continuous learning. This is about us as learning professionals, learning departments, getting away from this notion of the intervention and thinking about we serve audiences. Those audiences have business needs and problems to solve. But we have salespeople who need to sell more. We have widget makers who need to make more widgets, whatever it is, right? And how do we address their performance continuously rather than interventionally, right? This is going to mean, for those of you in the room, new sets of disciplines to master. So for instance, those best of high-impact learning organizations, of course, they're better than their peers at instructional design. They're better than their peers at project management. But you want to know what really separates them from the rest? Knowledge management, information architecture. How many of you know what information architecture is? A few. Which is great. I mean, that's tremendous. I happen to think that information architecture, specifically for those of you in the room who are instructional designers, that information architecture is a very much a sister discipline. And it's one that, in terms of the future of ISD, is one that I think there's a real potential for some sort of convergence. Right? Let me explain to you a little bit of what this is. Information architecture, for those, it's from the IT world. It is, for those of you who work for companies that have big public websites, I guarantee you've hired an information architect at some point in the design of that website. These are people who think about information spaces, digital spaces, and they're thinking about all the reasons why people come to those spaces, and how do I connect people to what they want to get, or what they want to do, as elegantly, quickly, efficiently as possible. How do I think about knowledge spatially? Okay? In reality, it's not all that different from what instructional designers do with an individual piece of instruction or an individual learning intervention or learning objective, what have you. But now you're thinking about it, I like to use an analogy. Instead of you being the playwright who wrote the play, you're the stage manager who has to put some really well-placed props on the stage so that when the actors come up, they'll just naturally act out the play you want them to act because you placed the props in just the right way. Put two things next to each other, think of it as sort of improv, they'll figure it out. Or more to the point, they'll come with kind of an idea of what they need to do to be successful at their business problem anyway, and you will have designed the space in such a way, you'll put just the right information in place in such a way that they'll figure it out and they'll get what they need done, at the speed they need it done, theoretically. So I think there's a tremendous place or potential convergence for information architecture, and we're certainly finding that with some of these organizations we've studied. Now, it also means new roles. I mentioned this notion of community management. We're seeing learning functions realizing they need to have content stewards and community managers. They need to think about programs bigger picture. So they have portfolio managers now, not just program managers. So not just somebody who manages sales training programs, but now they have a sales portfolio manager who's looking at the entire notion of sales enablement as one particular example. I threw this in here because I knew the crowd I was talking to tonight. I do think this means that the instructional designer in the corporate world is changing, and how the corporate world views you and your role in it is changing. More and more organizations are moving to models where there are fewer specialist IDs, and those IDs are not there to create content, they're there to supervise SMEs. So that model is becoming the standard model. It's for better or for worse, right? You're going to be using some of these other disciplines I talked about you're going to be needing to think of yourself as enabler, not just source. But here's the also really, I think, exciting thing. In that research we did last year about kind of what informal looks like when it's done well, we asked, part of that research, we did go out and we talked to business leaders, not HR leaders, not training leaders, but business leaders. And we asked them, in today's world, most of your employees are knowledge workers. So what's really standing in their way of being successful? And they told us things like they're just overwhelmed by knowledge. Okay? They have a hard time understanding what's relevant for them. They have a hard time finding the right thing. We don't necessarily have always the right tools to sort through it all, what have you, right? It's inconsistent. Knowledge is constantly changing our organizations. People create it with 10 different tools in 10 different ways every time, that kind of thing. Well, you know what? Those problems, this is about context setting, and it's about consistency. What do instructional designers do really well? They take knowledge and they put it into context so it can be consumed and mastered, right? They're used to working in consistent formats. There's a tremendous potential for the discipline that is instructional design to take what it does and apply it and apply that value beyond the walls of the training department. And we know a lot of learning organizations that are doing just that. I'll come to one of those stories before we're done. OK, I'm going to run through a bunch of things really quickly that just show you some of the other highlights of what we see changing. New methods. We're seeing, this has been going on for a long time, this gradual move away from the classroom, more virtual, more self-paced e-learning, what have you. We saw a dip in virtual classroom, and when I say this, I mean things like WebEx, but also things like Blackboard. We saw a dip a year or so ago in this, but that was as the economy in its worst throes. Most organizations just decided to stop spending anything. Then they remembered, oh yeah, classroom training is expensive, and so they've ramped back up again, going back to the virtual classroom, back to e-learning, what have you. Mobile. We are actually starting to see mobile break out. More and more organizations thinking about doing it. But it's not just, I want to consume a little piece of information or watch a video, watch a PowerPoint on my phone. It's increasingly decision support, especially, for instance, in the healthcare world is a good example. You're seeing organizations with some pretty sophisticated triage tools on mobile devices. And that, we think, is really the future of mobile learning, is not as an information distribution medium, but as much as a thinking support tool, right? Social learning. So this one's certainly gotten a lot of talk over the last couple of years. We see it showing up in 5 basic ways when it's intentional. A lot of social learning happens in organizations that's just unintentional, and that's always going to be the case, always has been. But when organizations do it intentionally, they're either blending into their formal programs, which is something we've all been doing all along anyway. We all know good training programs should have some group interaction, should have maybe some project work, get people talking to one another, working together, no-brainer stuff. What's different today is that organizations are being more explicit in calling out the social aspect of it. But then along with it, you have coaching and mentoring programs. We've all been doing those for a while, job rotations, what have you. You have communities of practice, which as a discipline has been around for a few years now. What's changed is that companies used to treat COPs as essentially a benefit, an optional thing. So let's say the engineers could take part in their COP, or the salespeople could take part in their COP, but no one required them to do it. It was just there if they wanted to do it. You're seeing more and more organizations make this the anchor of development for that particular audience. And everything else orbits around it. Expertise matching. How many of you have a corporate directory? Searchable directory, email addresses, what have you, right? These things are evolving. They're now becoming expertise directories. So a lot of companies are adding to them what you know, what projects you work on, what your interests are, what have you. And there are ways to find other people who you might need to help solve your problem. And then how many of you then have network building as a goal of your onboarding programs? More and more organizations are figuring that that's a huge part of their responsibility to new employees, is not just to acculturate them, not just to make sure they fill out all the right forms and what have you, but to also connect them to the 5 people who will save their life the first time something goes wrong. And it may not be the same 5 people that by org chart or by title you think they are, right? I was hearing a little conversation about the folks at RWD when I was swapping in. It sounds like that you have somebody who was like the linchpin in the organization. If they left, things would fall apart, right? Well, it's those, who's read Malcolm Gladwell, the mavens of the organization, right? And companies are recognizing that finding and building those connections is a huge and very important part of onboarding. And finally, you have these new environments, these social learning environments, these internal Facebooks for learning, which are great. And I'm going to talk about an example here in a sec. But we would say they're not necessarily where companies should start, right? There's lots of things you could be doing in social learning before you get there. Now, what's changing in terms of programs, Nationwide Insurance is a really good example of what, when you begin to throw together a lot of the things I've talked about. Well, first off, let me just ask this question. Anybody in here from Nationwide? It's always useful to find that out before you start talking about them, right? It's a good thing. So a couple of years ago, they recognized they needed to turn over their entire IT infrastructure really quickly. Okay, so the short version is their entire IT infrastructure was COBOL-based. I don't know if anybody of you know what that means, but it means really old. And it means that hiring new people to support their infrastructure was becoming almost impossible, really expensive. It meant that they couldn't do a lot of new things because they were just essentially anchored down by a 1,000-pound chain. And they needed to change. They had a choice. Do we hire a contractor to come in and redo everything? And that'll be quick. We'll meet all of our time goals. But then when all said and done, we won't have any of the expertise of the new system in place in-house. And it'll be really expensive. Or do we hire all new people? OK, we'll finish the project with the expertise in-house, but it'll take a really long time to get everybody up to speed. And then what do we do with all those people that we already have? Well, the third option is retrain the folks you already have. And they recognized that was probably the best answer for a lot of reasons. And so they started this massive retraining program. The timelines were crazy. They needed to do the whole thing in 2 years, including the training part. So retrain everybody, then roll out all new, brand new system, and in 2 years for this very large company. Right? And they recognized that to do this, any traditional way they might have done a learning program was not going to work. So they had to turn the mix on its ear. And so you see that pie chart. You can kind of sort of read it from back, I'm sure. Almost by measure, yes, there was some formal classroom training, but by far the smallest piece of the pie. The vast majority of the training was on the job, was peer-to-peer, was labs and exercises and so forth. It was a blend that looks like you've probably heard many people get up and talk to you about the whole 70-20-10, how much of learning is on the job versus in the classroom versus so forth. It was very much that breakdown. And the thing was is it was successful. They were able to actually turn over their whole IT infrastructure, retrain all of their current staff, and do it in essentially about 2 years' time, which is a pretty amazing accomplishment. Now, another example of kind of where a lot of this is going. Most of you are familiar with Cisco, I'm sure. Anybody from Cisco in the room? OK. Anybody in here, I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with action learning as a concept, right? The idea that if I give you, best way to teach you is something is let me give you a real project that you're not going to succeed if you don't figure it out, right? And of course, this has a couple of benefits. One, it's forcing that on-the-job experience. But two, it's also forcing collaboration. And when we interact, we retain, right? So Cisco has this program. They call this their Executive Action Learning Forum. This is their high-level, C-suite level leadership development program. So this is what they do for their high potentials. They're growing the people who they think will be their next generation of top-level leaders. They run about 40 to 60 people through it a year. At this point, they've done about 400 people overall. It's about 8 months long, end to end. It's a mix of online collaboration, a few in-person visits, but it's mostly around one big action learning project. And the teams are broken up into these smaller teams. They have these projects. These projects are real. They've been vetted by the business to have some real value. They have to be I mean, this only works if there's some amount of profile and prestige attached to these things, right? I mean, people are going to go out and work on this, make it good, right? Make it something that if it doesn't work, people will notice, right? Well, guess what? This has actually been a tremendous source of innovation for Cisco. One of their projects a couple years ago essentially turned into everything Cisco is doing today with regards to smart grids. All this talk we're hearing about, new electricity grids and what have you, right? Cisco estimates that project's going to generate about $5 billion of revenue in the next couple of years. That's a training project. You can't imagine also what this is doing to raising the value and profile of the learning organization at Cisco, right? Because they're involved and they're helping to make this happen. And they're stepping back and understanding that their role is, again, connecting people, kind of giving them the tools, letting them go to it, letting them work on it, what have you, right? And they're figuring it out, but they're figuring it out in ways that the business finds value in. Now, there are these learning environments. Some of you may have seen examples of these. Some of you may have actually gotten a chance to work at an organization that has one. Let me talk to you about one particular one, Dare to Share. Who's heard of British Telecom? Who's heard of the Dare to Share program? Because they've gotten quite a bit of press about this. No? OK. So this started out as a they actually did a little bit of an internal survey. They asked their employees, are we doing a good job training-wise? Are we actually helping you out developmentally? And their employees said, no, you're horrible at it. And they asked the management, too, are we doing a good job as a learning organization supporting you managers? No, you're horrible at it. So they're like, OK, what can we be doing better? Well, one, you could be doing it faster, because right now everything you do is too slow. It comes out, it's already out of date. You could also be really focusing on what we'd like you to train, not necessarily what you think you should train, because inevitably you run all our people through all these training classes, and they still come back to us and ask us a million stupid questions. So you could be more focused on what actually happens on the ground, right? Well, OK, so the learning organization recognized they had a problem. And they figured out one of the ways to potentially solve this problem was there were some things they could do to change what they did internally, and they worked on that. But one of the things they could do is to take advantage of the expertise that was already baked into the organization. Try and let the organization handle a lot of its own learning needs. So who in here knows about YouTube? Okay, I was going to be really shocked if I didn't see everybody's hands go up. Let me ask this question. Who's posted a video on YouTube? Good. There's a kind of literacy element of, it's one thing to say that everybody's been to YouTube, but every time I do these presentations, the number of hands that say, yes, I've posted, or yes, I've actually written an article on Wikipedia, what have you, the more that that percentage goes up, the more those are mainstream things. But in this case, it's an internal environment that looks a lot like YouTube. It is primarily video-driven. These are, to give you an idea of who the audience is here, these are field service technicians. These are the people who drive around in trucks and install phone services and fix telephone lines, what have you. They gave them cameras, little flip cameras, and said, you guys just start filming each other doing things well, how to solve a problem, how to answer a customer question, go to it. And at first, it kind of sort of took off, a little bit here, a little bit there, what have you. But then they got the idea, well, you know what? Maybe we needed to actually share some of what we in the learning organization know really well. So they put together little task teams, a couple instructional designers, multimedia people, what have you. And they started going around the company doing in-services and what it means to create 2 minutes of good video. Just, a little bit here, a little bit there, helping people to understand, you're letting the organization create a lot of learning content. Might as well give them a little bit of training in what it means to create good content. Right? That lit a fire under this. It has become a super successful program. They're now taking it to the rest of the organization. It's being embedded in all of in how they do training. I will say this. It is additive. It is not replacing what they do in terms of formal learning. They are very explicit in that. But what it does is it lets them focus their formal learning efforts truly on those things they know they need to, and lets the organization handle all of the other learning needs of the organization at the speed they need them handled. Okay? And it's been wildly successful because they were able to show the organization that this wasn't just a fad, that this was something they actually cared about. And they've actually been surprised at the overall quality of what they're getting back. In fact, in a few cases, just amazed at some random technician in the middle of nowhere, Scotland. They didn't even realize is now like, they've hired him into the learning organization because he was just tremendous at this. Right? And they're rolling this content into other places. There's value in it for other things. Marketing is finding value in it. Sales is finding value in it. Just the very notion of what this is and this notion of kind of internal collaboration and knowledge sharing has really changed how things work inside British Telecom. And it's helping them be more an innovative organization too, right? Because it's greasing the wheels for just how knowledge flows. So, a good example. This chart is whenever I talk about this notion of user content, I always get the question of, well, we can't do that because how do we know that it's good content? How do we know that it's accurate content? How do we know that it's not going to get us sued or it's not going to get somebody killed or what have you, right? The thing is that organizations that we know that have gone down this user-generated road, Sun is one, that's what this chart comes from, is what Sun's done with their learning exchange. They found that most of those concerns are relatively overblown. In reality, the communities are pretty good at policing themselves. Most communities are pretty good at jumping in, as long as it's not anonymous. People's names are attached to this stuff. It's actually far less risky than your email already is. It's far less risky than your voicemail already is. It's because people's names and reputations are on the line. They're only going to post what they think is correct. And if it is in the slight bit incorrect, the community is pretty good at stepping in and say, no, that's not the right way to do it, right? But that said, they've also found that just some commonsensical playground rules go a long way towards helping to solve this problem. Now, what I mean by playground rules, how many of you have kids? How many of you take your kids to the playground? A few, okay. When you go to the playground, how many of you, well, and this applies to any other playground, Chuck E. Cheese, Jamboree, what have you, right? Anywhere you go and interact with other kids, you have an expectation for how your kid will act, but you really have an expectation for how everybody else's kids will act, right? And whether it's explicit or implicit, there's kind of writing on the wall, and in some cases, in some playgrounds, there's real writing on the wall as to what is okay. Right? Well, whether it's Sun or Brinker, the people behind Chili's, or the British Telecom, or any other number of organizations that have gone down this road, a few common sense playground rules are all that is necessary. Your employees look at that and go, okay, yeah, we get it. We know what we're supposed to do. And what Sun did was break it out and say, certain topics, anything goes. You guys can post whatever you want. Certain topics, a content steward will have to at least eyeball it before it gets posted. And certain topics are off limits. They can only come from Sun. And the thing is just spelling that out in very simple, easy to follow terms was all they needed. Of course, you'll have technology decisions. That's not really today's topic, but you're going to have to think about social software and how social software plays into what you do. The good news good news, bad news is that most of your learning management system providers are adding these tools to their environments. But then you have to ask yourself, is your learning management system the right place for community and social learning? There's a real argument that maybe it's not. But most organizations have some kind of internet or portal. Most of those providers are also adding these technologies. We have what you see up here is we have an internal taxonomy we've done in our research for looking at social software. We would encourage you to not think about it in terms of blogs and wikis and the whole Web 2.0 thing. We would encourage you instead to think about it about the paradigms of interaction you're trying to encourage. I would encourage you not to say, we need to get a wiki. No, you don't. You need to find somewhere to get people to share content with one another. A wiki might be the way to do it today. It may not be the way to do it 10 years from now. And if you're thinking more about the activities you're trying to encourage, you won't get yourself backed into corners on the technology side. But I cannot stress enough as you go down this road and begin to start to tie together many of the different things I've talked about already this evening, how important this notion of a learning architecture really is, that you think about how all these things connect to one another. This particular example comes from Accenture. It's a very high-level version. This drills down below this to, they break everything out in terms of levels of competencies for each skill, and they can tell you that if I'm training somebody at level 1 in a skill, my learning architecture is going to look one way. It's going to be mostly classroom, mostly lab, things that are very much about intensive interaction with knowledge, practice, and the like. But if I'm trying to get somebody to level 5, then it's almost entirely informal. It's about interacting with peers, communities of practice. It's about working with your industry, writing white papers, making presentations, what have you, right? And they've bothered to define all of this, and it really gives them a sense of where they're going and how they're doing it. Okay, I'm going to close with a quick word about culture, and then I want to take some questions. British Telecom, this slide comes from them. They understood that they were only going to be successful at that whole program if insofar as they were able to motivate and encourage people to actually take part, contribute, right? They realized they had a real change management problem. They had a culture problem, right? And so they also recognized that in all the research that's been done on online communities, consistently, only a small percentage will actually contribute, will actually be the active folks. Most folks will respond. There's actually Jacob Nielsen, maybe some of you might be familiar with, did a study, and there's a pretty, it actually holds true, 1-9-90. 1% of your community will contribute actively. They will be the instigators, the go-to folks. 9% are going to respond. They're just going to be the followers. They're going to do a lot, but it's always going to be because somebody else did something first. And then 90% are going to lurk. They're going to sit and watch. They're going to sit and watch. So your challenge is, as you begin to try and use community and learning, is how to find the ones and co-opt them, and then how to keep those 9% on your side, and then how to get the 90% off the side occasionally. The thing is you're not going to move the numbers too much, and that's OK. But what do you need to see to know that you've been successful? That's the question. We did a study this summer. Well, actually, we released a study this summer. We're working on it for a couple years now, on this notion of cultures of learning. So what does this really mean? If I'm going to be moving some of these fundamental behaviors about knowledge, learning, what have you in the organization, what does a strong learning culture really look like, and what can I do about it? Well, we didn't want to do this in the ideal sense. We wanted to look at it in a truly business-grounded sense. So let me ask you this question. First off, do you think your organizations that you work in or that you currently, whether it's student or truly working, do you think your organizations, would you say that there's a strong culture of learning? Few. OK, good. But what does that mean? Quickly, just a quick idea. What would define that for you? How would you know?
We don't talk about mistakes. We talk about lessons learned, so it's in the language that we use.
OK. All right. So, but you're at least willing to look at those things. OK. Anyone else? Yeah.
When our product's being developed, at the beginning of all of our planning, training is involved.
OK. So learning is involved in the conversation as early as possible. OK. Anybody else? Yep.
We're an environmental firm, and even the language is very different in addition to culture.
OK. So the vocabulary reinforces. OK. Well, you see up here 10 performance outcomes, business outcomes, productivity, innovation, success in the market, customer satisfaction. I would hazard to guess that all of your organizations, whether you're public, private, education, what have you, there's things up here that your organizations care about. Your businesses, your stakeholders, whoever they are, they care about these things, right? We started with these 10 things and worked backwards. And then we went to a bunch of companies and we compared how well they're doing at these 10 things to about 100 possible variables that might define a learning culture. Some of them were very much related to learning. I mean learning in the department sense, L&D and the like, right? But a lot of them had nothing to do with L&D, and they had more to do with how the company works, right? And we were able to pull out 40 that we determined really define and actually predict these 10 things. And so in our minds, that's what a high-impact learning culture is that it's a culture that drives a notion or a value of learning, but not just learning for its own sake, learning for business success sake, right? The performance at those 10 outcomes, that's the yellow. As you'd imagine, another bell curve. Some organizations good, some not so good when you roll all the outcomes up. The top 10% at those business outcomes, that's in the red. I've colored it in just so you could, easy to see. That blue line are the top 10% at the 40 high-impact learning culture practices. There's a tremendous overlap between the strong learning cultures and the high performers. And when we start breaking this down in our study, we actually go deeper to that. We connect individual practices, individual areas to those different individual outcomes. The relationships are actually even stronger when you look at individual connections. Now, in your handouts, I think there's this is our culture model. What I want to point out for you is that there are the 40 practices break into 6 pretty easy to work with categories. Trust, and I mean trust between employees and trust to the employees of the organization. Learning is a risky thing. Employees have to feel to trust each other and trust the organization to truly learn. Reflection, your point about, does the organization value looking at what works and what doesn't work? How many of you have project post-mortem processes in your organizations? How many of you would say those project post-mortems generate something of value? They're not just checkbox activities. Pretty good. Because most organizations, they are just checkbox activities. That's a tremendous place for you as learning professionals to provide a little extra value to your companies. Is go to your businesses and say, look, let us go out and help managers, the ones who run those, the PMs and what have you. Let's help make them more effective, because that, of all the various different learning experiences in companies, that's going to be one of the most effective learning experiences that exists in your organization, because it is truly about finding out what's working and what's not working. And it's how the organization itself will learn. Again, this notion of learning agility. Demonstrating learning's value. So does the organization demonstrate in real ways that learning is actually worth doing, and that people who learn will be promoted and rewarded and developed, and that it's continued and reinforced, right? Knowledge sharing, pretty self-explanatory. Empowerment, obviously you want to encourage your employees to step outside of the box. That's how we will all learn. And finally, learning as a process. So how do you bake learning such that it happens regularly? The development planning process we talked about earlier, career development, talent management, all of the above. We have in your handouts a copy of all 40. These are the top 10. I just want to point out something quickly here, which is, look at like number 1. Leaders are open to bad news. Who would have thought that had anything to do with learning culture? But now that I've said that, that makes sense, right? Now, how many of you would say your organizations, that's true? Your leadership are truly open to bad news. Not happy about it, not complacent, but they'll hear it. Again, and as it turns out, these are ordered in terms of their rank of their overall effect on those outcomes. It turns out that one was by far the most impactful. Talk about whether or not an organization itself learns. Your leadership can hear bad news. Right? Asking questions. Makes sense, right? So you as learning professionals, what's your role in this? Well, obviously, you're going to do, most of these things are owned by your business. They're owned by your leadership. They're owned by not necessarily you in the learning department. But the thing is that we're finding as more and more learning organizations are recognizing that you do have a responsibility to, especially as you begin to evolve and you're beginning to depend more and more on knowledge sharing as a part of what you do. And knowledge share, and so that therefore your success is dependent on whether or not the organization values collaboration and knowledge sharing, right? Well, then you have to go out and make sure that's a value in the organization. And that means perhaps doing a little instigation, a little being a little bit of a provocateur, pressuring your leaders, encouraging your leaders, sometimes above the ground, sometimes underground, but encouraging these kinds of activities and behaviors to be valued and so forth, and to grow them. But I will say this, it's a mountain. The culture of your organization is a mountain, and so you have to think of it that way in terms of you're moving a mountain. The good news is that we know from our research that it is a mountain that is movable. But understand you're going to be doing it in little things here, little ways there, small increments, changing things subtly. For instance, like an after-action review or a project post-mortem process, getting out and figuring out how to make those kinds of processes better as a way to get started. And you have to recruit with learning culture in mind. You have to onboard with learning culture in mind. You have to take advantage of every learning opportunity with it in mind. Can't ever waste one of the strategies that we found is very successful is you can never waste those required training moments. So compliance training, you can't throw it away. Don't think of yourselves as having a brand, and don't let those few moments where you have everyone's eyeballs in the company be the one time you have everyone's eyeballs, they walk away with a bad taste in their mouth because all they ever know is at compliance training, it's horrible, right? You want them to walk away thinking that there's value in anything that is related to learning. Now, especially here in Washington, this is an apropos example. The Federal Reserve, not necessarily an organization who you might have imagined this is true, but it is. And I'm talking specifically about their branch that's in Cleveland, not necessarily the whole. But about as forward-thinking a organization when it comes to knowledge sharing and collaboration as there exists that I know of. Now, they're government, they're in the financial industry. Again, two areas that don't tend to get thought of as cutting edge when it comes to this sort of thing, but yet they are. They looked and recognized about 10 years ago, they saw that demographic problem staring in the face. They saw that they were about to lose a sizable percentage of their most senior auditors, people who actually go and sit down with executives to make sure that banks are in compliance. And they recognized they had a knowledge management issue. And that's how they approached it at first, was knowledge management. And they were trying to think about how to get the knowledge out of those senior folks' heads and in such a way that the, obviously, new folks would take advantage of it. Well, they recognized this was going to take a while, so they, again, moving a mountain, little things here and there, subtly moving the ball, subtly changing perspectives on collaboration and so forth. Because guess what? Think about it too. The very audience they actually wanted to get information out of were their most senior folks. Do you think these are also not the people who are least likely to want to collaborate? The least likely to want to, for instance, engage in anything to do with social media? Sort of the very audience they wanted to get out most were going to be most challenging to get to play ball, to get to play nicely with their other employees. So how do they go about it? Well, they started to do these things called collaboration days. They would they'd pick a topic. They'd say, okay, this week we're gonna talk about this particular kind of banking problem. And they'd invite some of the best of their auditors in. And they would just say, look, all we want you to do is sit around a table. We're going to give you a topic. You guys go. Just talk. Well, of course, they may not necessarily want to collaborate, but they're happy to talk shop, war stories endlessly, right? Well, the learning organization was sitting in the corner with a camera, and they're recording these conversations. And then they take these conversations, they break them into little 2-minute chunks, and they put those 2-minute chunks into a searchable knowledge base. And they start to introduce these chunks to the organization subtly by, in their training programs, they would start to use them as supplemental materials. They actually let them use them as a performance support tool on their assessments, and so forth, right? They got new hires used to them. Well, a weird thing happened. Who in here has seen the commercial from Intel about the guy who invented USB? Intel's really good at trying to make the point that we have employees who are rock stars. And the rest, most people are like, USB? Okay, that's that thing on the side of my computer, right? Well, they're making the point that there's an expertise there, and it has a tremendous amount of internal value, right? Well, the same thing was happening in the Federal Reserve. People were beginning to recognize some of these senior auditors and go, oh, you're that guy, right? And overnight, almost, they suddenly were creating a value for sharing expertise. And today, they have to turn volunteers away. And some of their most senior people, most curmudgeonly, most resistant to the whole concept of collaboration and knowledge sharing, are some of the most biggest proponents for it. And they've been able to actually affect institutional change because of it. Knowledge sharing is now a competence on many people's job descriptions. It is something that people are rated and rewarded for. It is something that is considered, everybody in that organization would now say it is part of their job to develop everybody else. They didn't get there overnight, but that's where they're at now. And they see that. The learning organization understands that that value and cultivating that value is just as important as any program they will ever develop. And so everything they ever develop programmatically always has to reinforce that value. Okay. So, as I said, how your business operates, though, not necessarily how you as the training department operates. So your role will always be, for the most part, shaping, guiding, pushing, prodding. But take advantage of those things where you actually do have control. It is worth doing. Organizations that have strong learning cultures, 46% more likely to be the first to market. 26% likely to have higher quality products. So it's worth doing. Learning culture, we found, one of the biggest messages we found in the study is that it's a business strategy, not just a learning one. So your challenge, closing, one, are you as aligned with your business as you could be? Because you need to be working on what they want you to work on. Can you do it at the speed they want you to do it at? Do you have all the right disciplines in place, not just instructional design? And how agile are you as learning organizations, as learning professionals yourselves, and what you're adding to your own expertise? And then the businesses you serve, how agile are they? All right, so that is it for me. If you'd like to know more about us, we have a website. I'd encourage you to follow it, a blog, follow me on Twitter, what have you. We only gave you a few of the handouts just because we didn't want to dump the whole presentation on you. If you'd like the deck, just come drop a card with me or give me some kind of contact information and we'll get you the presentation. Can I answer anybody's questions? Any comments? Any things that seem challenging? Yep.
Early on, you showed a slide of the forces of change.
Sure.
I forget exactly what they were, but what would you say the percentages are for those four different changes?
Oh, that's a really, I think, It's a good question, but I think it's almost impossible to answer because I think it's going to be different for different companies. We look at a lot of, especially, for instance, the maturity of the organization would speak to a lot of that, right? If you're a brand new startup, you're in a different set of pressures than if you're a very well-established global conglomerate. So some of the pressures related to technology or related to the demographics of your workforce are going to be different depending on the industries you work in, the verticals, the parts of the world that you work in. So yeah, I wish I could give you an answer to that, but I think it's going to be almost different for every company out there because everybody has a slightly different footprint. Anybody else? Other questions? Oh, yeah.
Some of what we hear a lot from learning professionals, and even CLOs, is they get what you're saying about the importance of being aligned with and linked with the business, but they have a real challenge getting a seat at the table. Any thoughts on that? Sure.
It's that seat at the table conversation comes up a lot. I would say I think there's. Let me answer that kind of in two parts. One, there was actually was having a conversation with Greg here beforehand, and it was about a lot of you in the room are instructional designers, and I get a chance to talk to folks in the learning profession who are practiced, educated in the learning profession, such as yourselves, and I get also get a chance to work a lot with business leaders and stakeholders who aren't, and there's always this continual battle of will the learning profession kind of get the respect as a discipline from its business leaders that it thinks that it deserves, right? And the thing is that learning professionals will often wonder, well, IT doesn't have this problem, right? Well, IT also, why is it that IT gets to do things and the business doesn't ever think, the business doesn't ever kind of jump in and think, well, I can do what IT can do, right? No, because they kind of think of what IT does as sort of like this arcane art, and it's a black box, and whatever the IT guy says, right? Because I don't know how to do that. But yet, the business leader has no problem saying, well, I can train, right? They have no problem making that leap. Well, that kind of creates a respect problem, right? And so that seat at the table issue becomes well, they kind of wonder, what value are you going to bring that I can't already do? What part of the conversation are you going to add to that I couldn't have already thought of? So we have a challenge there, a real challenge. Part of it's proving that, I talked earlier about this notion, for instance, of integrated talent management. That's going to be part of the answer, is helping the business understand that learning is part of the strategic success of the organization. And this is the key part where I talked earlier about business-driven. You have to talk in business terms. Don't try to justify or don't try to prove your worth in learning language. To be quite honest, your business stakeholders should never hear the words Kirkpatrick. It should just never happen. They don't care, right? What they care about is that they're going to have more salespeople in place when they need them. Or they have people who are, fewer errors, higher quality, whatever it is, right? And that you think in those terms, that you talk in those terms, that whether it's tactically or strategically, you're helping them to understand that just like supply chain, just like in order to be successful, they're going to have resources and widgets in place. They have to have people in place too. And you know a lot about that, right? And you can help make sure those people are in place. But that requires everybody in this room to be a bit more strategic in how they do. And again, thinking more environmentally, not just interventionally. That's so I would say that. But I also will add this point. This is specifically what Greg and I were talking beforehand. When you go home at the end of the day and you pat yourself on the back and you say, I did a good job today, most instructional designers do that, and they kind of get the self-actualization comes from you created a really highly crafted piece of instruction. Every learning objective was well written, it was well designed, well thought out. Everything about it fit with what everything about your discipline says is good, right? But guess what? All those ways that you're defining your success, again, your business really couldn't care less. So what your challenge is how do you change it such that when you go home at the end of the day and you pat yourself in the back and you think you had a really good day, it's because you moved a business metric, right? It's because somehow there's people out there selling more. There's people out there making higher quality widgets, or you have more people prepared to do the job on time, whatever it is. That's what you have to define your success by. And that's I think our challenge as an industry, as an organization, is to reframe what we do as putting the right people in the right place to be successful, not necessarily design of instruction, right? Because design of instruction is just one way you go about it. So, performance consulting as a discipline, obviously we've been talking about that for quite a while now, and a key part of performance consulting is that training is rarely the solution, right? And many organizations still come to you wanting training as the solution. So I think Greg said he had somebody he was telling me the story beforehand of somebody who got the reputation as being the training guy who never wanted to do training, right? And that makes some sense. But we still have a kind of a change management issue there, a marketing issue almost, right? To prove to our businesses that, training isn't necessarily always the solution, but how can we help you find that solution? How can we think bigger picture? How can we think environmentally, not just intervention-based? We have lots of great examples of companies that are very good at it, but I wish I had that kind of magic, come back to your question, that kind of magic bullet answer. I think it's a long-term process of proving strategic value. And part of it's going to be that talent management piece, I think. Part of it's also just going to be, again, us changing the language that we speak. Right? Other questions, other comments? Yep.
I think there's two other parts to it, and you touched on one. I think you need to learn how to promote yourself better.
Yeah.
And more clearly.
Sure.
But I also think that you have to get dirty. You can't stay in a nice little suit and be really tactical in your organization as well.
That's true.
If you're training people to put lug nuts on wheels, you need to know what a lug nut is, you need to know what a wheel is.
Absolutely.
And you have to know how those people are feeling about doing that job. And I think that means getting out there a lot more than I think many trainers do.
Agreed. I think there's we study a lot just the overall organ governance of learning programs and learning structures and organizations. And we certainly saw for a few years now, there's been a move towards consolidation, but of a new kind of consolidation. We don't see, there aren't a lot of new corporate universities being created, right? But what you do see more and more of are these federated structures where you have a kind of core learning function that handles common programs, maybe the technology in the organization, the LMS, a few other shared services that make sense at the core, and the business units then do their own thing but there's a federation between the two of them, right? But one of the things that we get, our members will come to us all the time and ask us, well, how does that work when it's done well? Can you connect us with other companies that do that? How do I answer this problem? How do I solve this, make this decision, what have you? One of the most common questions we would get would be, you know what, we want to create a shared service for instructional design. We want to create this little factory that sits in the core of the company that all the business units could come to and say, can you create content for us? Because we think that there'll be economies of scale, that we'll be able to hire some specialists in maybe multimedia and higher end simulation, what have you, that maybe the business units couldn't afford by themselves. That this would be a good model, right? And I know of some companies who've been very successful at it. But I would say, and this, anecdotally, because this is a relatively new area. I don't have a lot of great data here. Again, it's just stories. But anecdotally, I would say that more companies than not that have tried to go down that road have actually found it very, very challenging for a lot of what you're just describing. Because there's always been this notion that a good instructional designer can create any training, doesn't matter what it is. And that is true. But I think the moment that you take the instructional designer and disconnect them from their business in that degree, right, then why would they come to you versus not going to any other external third-party content developer? You've removed the reason why that they're of real value to your company is that you're in your company. They know your company well, right? So I think we need to make sure that as we do what we do, that we don't lose sight of being masters at what our business does. And trying to resist too much being the completely disconnected instructional designer. That's as much personal opinion too. But I think that kind of trainers or instructional designers. Other comments, questions? Yep.
Could you talk a little more about deep specialization? Today I was reading online about a guy who met two people in their 60s, and the one guy worked as a radio ad guy.
Yeah.
And the other person was a black and white photographer. And how both those are pretty specialized skills and now are no longer needed. So how do companies perceive deep specialization? I get someone to know something really well, but then the moment something shifts, I can move them off the boat?
No, it's a risk. But I think you're also thinking, coming back to vocabulary, is what answers that question. We're hearing more and more companies using the word capability instead of skills and competencies, right? Because I can train you in a skill, but that skill applies for as long as that job does. But instead it might be more appropriate to train you in a capability, which is a little bit more flexible, right? It's subtle and maybe it's semantics, but we hear that shift. Okay, I think what you're mentioning, I think, is a real risk. But I think some of the organizations, even I talked about earlier, the Boeings of the world, for instance, the thing is that they're really good at moving people around. Another notion that is a big, it's popping up in all of our research practices, not just learning, but also in HR, in recruiting, in performance, what have you, is this notion of talent mobility. That's becoming a key metric for the people side of organizations. It's the degree to which talent is truly mobile in your organization, that when you need it, you could move it from point A to point B, from department A to department B, from skill set A to skill set B, that talent is truly mobile. The degree to which it is obviously makes your organization more agile, right? But is that to some degree almost counter to what I was talking about, sort of specialization? Actually, no. It's just those organizations are becoming really, really good at building expertise very quickly. And in knowing that you may be in a feeder position to one of 3 or 4 specialist endpoints, but their organization has gotten mature enough and is really good at what it does that if today they think you're targeted for that endpoint, tomorrow it's going to be that endpoint, but the switch was not that difficult, or not as difficult as it could be. But I think your question is spot on. I think it really is a risk. It really is a challenge.
Thanks.
Okay. Anything else? Other questions, comments? Thank you.
For one, when I walked in, I didn't know what black and gold is. Now I know. Looking at the cover here.
Yeah.
And I'm also getting the, this is a bunch of retrievers. I don't understand this, but I really enjoy your presentation because I have good days and bad days as a learning consultant. And my best days are if I'm talking to an engineer, if I can use the vocabulary and understand the culture, very excellent conversation. That's the best day as a learning consultant. So I think I now understand why the case based on the presentation. So thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad you did. Other comments? Other questions?
David?
Well, yep.
You
The
have
voice.
no words. You can tell I use microphones a lot.
Yes,
Before
yes,
everybody
Greg?
goes on their merry way, I want to give you this token of our appreciation, and I
Thank
want
you.
to ask the crowd in thanking David for his time and expertise.
Oh, after you? Okay. Oh, wow. Thank you. A hat?
You got to keep the sticker on here. That's cool.
Oh, to keep stick? Yeah.
My 11-year-old's on that.
Is that just means I just won something?
Right.
Yeah.
David has also pledged if you give him a business card to send his
Yep.
PowerPoint deck to you, if you want that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, thank you very much for having me and my organization. And thank you guys for hanging around and listening to me. My best day is when I have these presentations and you guys all leave happy. This is what we do. So if you keep the conversation going, again, follow us on our blog, Twitter, what have you. Feel free to reach out to me. I would love to hear, as you take this back to your organizations, to your jobs, and what have you. I love talking knowing that a lot of you are early in your careers because you guys are going to be the ones who actually change the industry. And I'd like to know how it goes. That's what we do. So tell me about it.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.